start in a sec. By the way, the presenter for the second talk, are they here? Awesome. Okay, great. So, thank you all for coming to this session on predictive analytics. We've got 3 really fun talks ahead of us. I guess our first speaker is Jun An from University of Maryland College Park. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here. Today I'll be talking about a study that I've done with Facebook data, and particularly what we can learn from Facebook looking at new media literacies from activity data from the Facebook platform. Just before I start, I guess Ryan's going to tell me if I'm going over or whatnot. But I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and if I'm working from the previous panel and talking about how I identify myself, I would say I'm an education researcher who happens to do a lot of work with technology and educational technology, and particularly with data that we cull from technology platforms. So I work in the College of Information Studies, so we care about information and how we make sense of information. And I'm also a joint appointment in the College of Education. So, the motivation for the study, I think we all kind of understand the evolution of our society and how social media plays a big role in our everyday life. One of my research areas is looking at young people's use of social media and its implications for learning. And quite naturally, this study arose out of looking at data from young people and teenagers, and trying to figure out how do we make sense of their behaviors in Facebook in a learning perspective. So one way that kind of the changing technological world has been implicated in how we as researchers and scholars think about learning is this kind of idea of literacy. And you'll hear certain terms used, and in some camps it's called 21st century literacies, and that kind of refers to the different skills that people need. A literacy is a skill or a way of doing something, and so people have been thinking about how do we do things differently when technology plays a role in our interactions. One example is a skill like networking. So networking in a face-to-face environment is different than networking in a distributed environment like Twitter or Facebook. And so a lot of literacy scholars are focused on explicating what are those skills in these different contexts. And so one consideration to think about is that literacy is very contextual. It's bounded by the context that you're working in and the skills that you need in that context. There are another group of scholars, primarily from digital humanities and other humanities fields, looking at what's called new media literacy. So Howard Rheingold is one example of a person who's thinking deeply about when we interact in networked environments, what kinds of skills do we need there? And he suggests things like information evaluation skills are very important when information is ubiquitously available, right? So how do we evaluate that something, in his terms, isn't crap and something is good? You know, being able to communicate across cultures and across diverse groups of people become important when we're distributed and connected to each other in networked environments. So there's a whole slew of other kind of skills that people are terming new media literacies. And in this study, I built from one very kind of high-profile, well-cited explication of new media literacy. So Henry Jenkins, who's a humanist and wrote a widely cited paper for the MacArthur Foundation, kind of explicating, so in this digital media environment, what are the particular skills that he thinks people will need to be successful? So he lists out a couple of literacies. So play refers to the ability to tinker with one's environment and test out new technologies. Performance he refers to as the ability to take on different identities. So when you're interacting in online communities, taking different identities and playing with those identities. Simulation is being able to create environments that we test out ourselves, collect data, and come up with new ideas. Appropriation. So appropriation refers to the skill of, in our world, we now have access to lots of information artifacts, and we can very easily copy and create new artifacts from that prior work. And what are the skills involved in remixing and those kinds of cultural practices? Multitasking is the ability to switch tasks seamlessly. So, when we're in an environment like this, how do you also listen to a talk while also tweeting about it and checking your Facebook or checking your email? Being able to do that well is a process that's learned, right? Distributed cognition is an idea that we can use our technologies to enhance our cognitive abilities. So taking notes, sharing bookmarks, those are distributed cognition kind of examples. Collective intelligence is, so now we have access to each other in distributed platforms. How do we effectively collaborate with each other to develop knowledge, right? So that's a different skill than doing that in a face-to-face classroom. Judgment, I talked about that. That refers to analyzing and evaluating information credibility. Transmedia navigation is a term that Jenkins uses. So in our world, we can now follow the trajectory of stories and information across multiple platforms. So I can talk to you about my talk. I'll post my slides to SlideShare. Someone will tweet it and someone will retweet it. It'll appear on Facebook, right? So we can follow the trajectory of the conversation across multiple platforms, and being tuned into those platforms is a skill. Networking is being able to leverage all of us for our own benefit in developing relationships. And negotiation, so how do we negotiate different cultures and different groups of communities that we're all a part of. A lot of the literacy work involves deep qualitative observation of how people are using new technologies and what it means in their lives. And it struck me that we have this opportunity in our social media environments to collect lots of trace data about people's behaviors. And of course the trick is, how do we make sense of that trace data in social media? And how do we come up with some useful insights about what people are learning in their social media communities? So I've been inspired a little bit from the learning analytics community about this idea of social learning analytics, which involves a focus on understanding people's behaviors, their dispositions. And if you think about literacy, literacy is kind of a collection of behaviors, dispositions, identities. It's about who you are and what you know how to do. An idea that I play with in this paper is that we can use behavioral data from our social media platforms to gain some insight about what people's literacy skills are. So I wanted to test the validity of the idea. So I conducted an exploratory study looking at two things. I wanted to know if the Facebook data that I could collect from users would cluster into conceptually distinct behaviors. So do we do certain things in Facebook that we don't do in other platforms, right? And I think that's kind of an initial question. But I was also interested in whether or not these behaviors that we could observe in Facebook correlate with measures of new media literacy skills. So the skills that we defined from Jenkins's framework, does this behavioral data correlate, and are they indicators of these new media literacy skills? So what did I do? So I conducted a survey study. It was an online survey, and the first part of the survey collected demographic data, gender, age, education level, things of that nature, along with the general measure of technology literacy that I use as a control variable. And then the survey collected several measures of new media literacy skills. I took the scales from Henry Jenkins, and a student of his had created an experimental scale to try to measure some of these concepts that he wrote this conceptual paper for. And there were several scales that had particularly good internal reliability and validity, and so we use those scales. So the first scale measured negotiation, the second networking, third information judgment, the fourth play, fifth multitasking, remixing, which was appropriation, and also transmedia navigation. And details of the scales are in the paper, and also the paper that I cite from them. But if you look at the construction of the scales, The questions are a lot about dispositions. So how likely am I to engage in transmedia navigation, right? Or how familiar am I with what transmedia navigation is, right? So these are kind of measures of people's dispositions of their literacies. After somebody completed the survey, they were invited to connect their Facebook data and share their data, their publicly available data with me. And that involved creating a Facebook app that connected to the online survey. And so participants who volunteered would connect their Facebook accounts, and we'd do a one-time snapshot of their public data. So what did we collect? We collected, or I collected the counts of their emails received, the emails that they've written to other people on Facebook, the number of friends they have in their network, their friend lists. So on Facebook, you can create different lists of friends for the purposes of sharing different information with different groups, right? So you could create a coworker group and a family friends group, and you can manage the information shared in those networks. So I collected a measure of how many friends lists people create to curate their friends. There was a count of how many links shared. So in your Facebook feed, your different friends can share hyperlinks to other information. Member pages, which are special pages that are affinity groups in Facebook. The number of networks that they affiliate with. So you can affiliate with a geographic network or an alumni network, things of that nature. Notes, so at the time of data collection, Facebook had kind of this idea of notes, which are individual blog posts that people could write and share on their Facebook. The app collected the number of photos shared, the number of status messages, videos, and wall posts, which are public wall posts to other friends that people have posted. So this whole data collection was a series of survey measures along with behavioral data, raw counts of people's activities on Facebook. So thinking back to the two research questions, the first thing I did was look at all this activity data and examine kind of the covariance and the correlation between these behaviors, and using an exploratory factor analysis, trying to distill this raw data into conceptually distinct particular behaviors. So what do we do on Facebook, right? What does all this raw data mean? And the second analysis that I conducted was a regression model looking at whether or not these behaviors correlated to measures of the new media literacy skills. So what did I find? So there were 4 factors in this analysis that I found. The first one, which I call messaging behaviors. So emails written, emails received, the number of wall posts that you post to other people's walls, and the status messages that you write about yourself that you share with your network, all kind of clustered together and these are all kind of examples of messaging. So you communicating with your network and people communicating with each other. So that was the first factor. The second factor I called information sharing. And so the status messages you wrote, the friend lists that you curated, the links and photos that you shared, and the member pages that you were a part of clustered together into this kind of behavior. And I call this information sharing because all of these behaviors involve some mode of curating the information that you decide to share with your network, right? So creating a friend list is an explicit action to say, I've thought about my network and I'm, separating them out into groups that I'm sharing specific information to. Links and photos are information that I'm choosing to share with my network from external sources. Member pages are affiliations that I'm choosing to share with people. So if I join and if I like a page for some company, I'm actually communicating to my network some information about myself. The third factor was friending behavior, and that primarily was made up with obviously the size of one's friends network. But interestingly, the propensity to share notes or blog posts and the propensity to post videos were negatively associated with this factor, which bears some further exploration. And the fourth was what I call affiliating, and that was entirely made up of how many networks you decide to affiliate with. So do I affiliate with my alumni network or my geographic network, et cetera. So taking those 4 behaviors, and I think that those 4 are kind of an accurate characterization of what we do on Facebook, right? And in some ways, the findings are comforting because they have some sort of external validity, right? If we think about our own Facebook activity, we could probably think about our activity falling under one of those categories. What I did next was look at regressions and correlations between those behaviors and the new media literacy measures that we collected in the survey. Oh, sorry for the cutoff there, but so looking at messaging behaviors, information sharing behaviors, friending and affiliating, and what they predicted or what they were indicators of. So messaging was a strong, these are all standardized coefficients, so it's increase in a behavior is related to a standard deviation increase in the outcome measure. So messaging was significantly related to one's disposition for negotiation. So people who messaged more often on Facebook were also more likely to say that they were comfortable negotiating norms and conversations across diverse groups, right? People who shared more messages scored higher on the networking scale. Some other predictors, so information sharing and affiliating were also high predictors of networking ability, which also probably is not that surprising. So Facebook is a social network site. So more activity in these the features that Facebook provides, probably it's kind of comforting that they're highly related. But there are also some literacy areas that weren't predicted by Facebook activity. So information judgment. So being an active Facebook user was not related to dispositions related to information judgment. Play. So being able to tinker with different technologies. So our behaviors on Facebook weren't really related to play. Multitasking. Probably not surprising. So being an avid Facebook user did not also make you a good multitasker or related to being a good multitasker. But information sharing was positively correlated with your appropriation and transmedia navigation skills. So that makes a lot of sense as well. So Facebook as an information sharing platform probably helps us think about the ways that we remix content and share that content and the ways that we follow content across different platforms, right? And so it seems like people are taking advantage of that capability as well. So a couple of takeaways from the study. I started out thinking about the ubiquitous nature of social data and how do we make sense of that. And one of the kind of themes that I'm hearing in this conference is that theoretical frameworks are really important. So we have all this behavioral data with Facebook. And I think what's kind of fun about this study is I wanted to use a framework from humanists and from literacy scholars to say, how do we recast behavior in Facebook as a literacy practice, right? And from that, I think there's some validity to saying, there's some validity of the evidence in this study to talk about how we can start to recognize people's dispositions and some of their soft skills just from their everyday activity. So collecting everyday data from different platforms and making visible kind of the skills that we learn from those platforms. And so that changes the conversation a little bit to Facebook as a distraction, to Facebook as a platform that develops different types of skills, right? What the study also kind of highlights for me is that I only considered Facebook as a platform, right? And what's nice is that in the data itself, I could kind of observe distinct behaviors that happen in Facebook and distinct literacies that those behaviors were correlated with. And that also begs the question then of what do other platforms afford? And what other behaviors do they afford, and what other literacy skills do they afford? And so I think future studies that could look across platforms would be good. And also, it increases kind of the nuance within which we can talk about platforms. So, in my work with educators, a lot of the conversation is we need to utilize social media because it develops 21st century literacy skills, or it develops media literacy skills. And I think now these types of studies might lend some nuance to that conversation. So it's like, we could use Facebook for learning purposes, but what skills do Facebook afford particularly, right? We could use YouTube, but what skills does participating in YouTube afford? And I think there needs to be more nuance to that conversation as well. And lastly, I think it would be interesting to think about visualizations and practical applications. So a lot of the work in this conference has been around data dashboards and things of that nature. And I wonder what the implications are for making visible soft skills, right? Letting people analyze their own social media data and understand the literacies that they might have embedded within their participation. That's not really apparent just by participating in those platforms. So a couple of limitations in the study. It was a very exploratory study. So the sample was approximately about 100 folks who participated and shared their data. And maybe a very interesting outcome of the study that I learned about was the challenge of data collection. So on the one hand, I started out with that slide that social media data is ubiquitous. Well, it is, but it's not really ubiquitously available, right? And so the number of survey participants who actively took the survey and volunteered their Facebook data was very small. So it's still difficult as researchers, right, unless we were part of Facebook's data team to collect that data. I was very concerned with privacy and granularity, and so I discussed that in the paper. You'll notice that the counts, the variables, the behavioral data that I collect in Facebook were all counts, aggregate counts of behavior, right? And so I didn't collect finer-grained data or variables of particular practices, and that limits the types of analyses one can do, right? So I collected the number of friends people had, but I didn't collect the names of all of their networks, right? And so I can do things like look at factor analysis models, but I can't do things like social network analysis, right, with that kind of data collection. The sample is limited, and there's one platform that I looked at, which I had noted before, and I think this type of data collection from social media platforms, repurposing those variables in different analytical models to look at literacy is a ripe area for future study, and I'd invite any conversation about that as well. So thank you. You can find me on Twitter and also email me, and I welcome any questions and comments. Thanks.
We have several minutes for comments, so the question.
Hi, June. Sean Goggins, Drexel University. So you've shown us that people are actually learning important skills in these new media environments by using Facebook. And Facebook has sort of gained its reputation because it's so easy to quote-unquote use. And I'm sure they don't have any of these objectives in their design. And so I'm curious, how might one take what you've learned and influence the design or the way that we model use of Facebook so that it does more to develop these new literacies that you described?
So there's an interesting tension, because I think you're absolutely right. I don't think Facebook is concerned with developing a learning platform or the fact that we learn anything, right, from using it. Analytically, as researchers, we have been given a platform, and we're kind of observing learning happening in that platform after the fact. In terms of design considerations, I think something that this analysis could speak to is the idea of very finely explicating what skills happen in the wild, right? Maybe not a priori from an educator's perspective or whatnot, but just, what is our everyday kind of activity? What are we learning from that? And perhaps we might think about platforms designing for that, right? So, from my data, it looks like Facebook is very good for sharing links and taking people down a path across transmedia platforms, right? But if you wanted to say something about play, the ability to tinker, right, with technology, right? Maybe, Facebook could take that data and say, well, what would we design to encourage play? Or we don't care about play at all, and play is something that another platform might afford better, right? And so I think having more nuance to that conversation is the bigger contribution.
Hi, Director Bla, Maastricht University. In terms of learning, how certain are you that people learn? Because you have correlations between learning and Facebook use. Might not be the reverse relation be in play, that those who are skillful use Facebook more often than those who are less skillful.
Absolutely. So that's a great point. So this was a sectional study on one-time snapshot. So you're absolutely right that the correlation does not imply any kind of causality in either direction. I think what would be needed is kind of, we're now, this study is a step in developing indicators, right, and collecting variables and organizing those behavioral variables into categories that we could use in longitudinal studies to kind of say, so what is that kind of longitudinal relationship? Is it your dispositions predicting your Facebook behavior, or is it your Facebook behavior predicting your dispositions? And I think with any complex social process like literacy, is probably the answer is a little bit of both. Your prior starting point is going to influence your behavior, and also what you do in Facebook is going to influence your behavior as well.
So one question I had is, I think this is really interesting results. There's a lot of talk about the so-called digital natives, and that younger generations are more comfortable with technology like Facebook than the older generations, which made me wonder if you were to kind of take within, populations. I don't know how much your sample has different age groups, for example, but you could conceive of having a larger sample. Have you thought at all or looked at all at whether demographic or age factors actually play a role in the strength of those correlations you're seeing?
Right. So with certain number, so age was one of the control variables in the model. So I could disaggregate that data, even though it's a very limited sample. So I'm not sure how much I could do that, and look at whether or not different age groups had different propensities. But I think what we'll see is less of an age relationship and more of an experience relationship. So one thing I might have collected in this study that I didn't is the length of membership time in Facebook. So when did I sign up and how long have I been there? That might actually be a bigger predictor than age. I think the idea of digital natives is kind of a misrepresentation of young people. So young people aren't born knowing how to Facebook out of the womb. And it's a learned behavior, right? And it's a cultural behavior. And so I think experience level is probably a bigger predictor than age. Thank you very much. Oh, one more question. Okay.
Oh, I was just going to say, Charles Lang from Harvard Graduate School of Education. My Facebook persona is kind of better than me in all respects. Are you concerned that maybe the transferability of the connections that you're seeing won't be there because people have these kind of invented personas in Facebook?
Right. So what's nice about the data is I didn't actually collect the content of what people posted or the valence or the nature of what you posted. I collected raw counts of what you actually did, right? So you might present yourself very well on Facebook, but it didn't play into the analysis. I collected whether or not you were a hyperlinker, or whether or not you were an avid wall poster, or whether or not you were posting personal blog posts or videos, or a prolific photographer and sharing your photos, right? So I think that raw behavioral data, maybe that could be a strength of that, is that there's less of that subjective quality of, so what am I presenting? It's more of how prolific am I in doing these kinds of practices. But that's a great question as well. Thank you.